Okay, let's plunge into something truly monumental today. We're talking about the Indian Constitution, that foundational document that came into effect on January 26th, 1950.
A huge moment in history.
Absolutely. And right away, it grabs your attention for one striking reason. It's the world's longest constitution. I mean, originally over 145,000 words, growing even longer later.
Yeah, it's massive. Around 395 articles, 12 schedules now. It's intricate.
For a nation just coming out of, what, over 200 years of colonial rule, taking its first steps?
Yeah.
You just have to ask why. Why so incredibly long, so complex, so detailed?
Well, that length isn't just paperwork for its own sake. It really reflects the sheer scale of India, the immense diversity, and honestly, the profound challenges the country was facing right then.
So it was a response to the situation.
Exactly. Our sources make it pretty clear. This wasn't just about writing down some rules. It was a massive attempt to knit together a nation from deep historical divisions to deal with the fresh, raw wounds of partition.
Which we'll definitely get into.
Oh, yes. And to try and build a framework for democracy in a society that was deeply hierarchical for centuries, crafting something strong enough for that job. Well, it took detail, painstaking detail.
It sounds like it was more than just governance. It was almost like an act of social engineering, trying to imagine a new kind of society.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
You're trying to get people from every background imaginable, different religions, languages, castes, economic levels, to basically buy into a shared future, a shared set of rules and rights.
And somehow plant democratic ideas where, frankly, the soil wasn't always fertile for them, historically speaking.
Precisely. And that incredible challenge, that mission, is what we're diving deep into today. We're going back to the actual making of India's constitution, that period between December 1946 and November 1949.
And for this deep dive, we're leaning on some fascinating sources. We've got historical texts that really document the process, but also, crucially, the actual voices, the arguments, the debates from the Constituent Assembly itself.
Yeah, hearing those voices really brings it to life.
So our aim here is to unpack that historical context, understand the really intense debates, the arguments, the compromises, and get a sense of the vision the founders had for this brand new nation. We want to give you, our listener, a shortcut to grasping this absolutely pivotal moment.
And setting that stage, the historical context, is just essential. Because the world outside the assembly, it wasn't just background noise. It was constantly breaking in, influencing the debates.
Right.
These years, December 46 to November 49, one source calls them exceptionally tumultuous. A time of incredible hope, obviously, with independence finally happened.
The dream realized.
But also shadowed by just abject disappointment.
And that disappointment, that has to be partition.
Yeah.
Independence Day, August 15th, 1947, inextricably linked with the division of the country.
Exactly. The source emphasizes that the images of desolation and destruction continued to haunt members of the Constituent Assembly. You look at pictures from that time, some referenced in our sources, and they just hit you. The scale of the violence, the uprooting, all happening while these members are trying to carefully draft articles about justice and equality.
Let's dig into that backdrop a bit more, because it really did shape everything. Even before independence, there were these powerful popular movements against the British.
Oh, absolutely. The Quit India movement in 1942.
Yeah.
The source calls it perhaps the most widespread popular movement.
Right.
Then you had Subhas Chandra Bose trying to organize armed struggle with foreign help. And a really significant event just before the assembly got going properly, the naval ratings rising up in Bombay and other cities in spring 46.
A mutiny, basically, within the armed forces.
A major signal. And alongside these big moments, you had, as the source puts it, periodic, if scattered, mass protests of workers and peasants bubbling up in the late 40s.
And the fascinating thing, the source says, was the unity in some of these protests.
Yes, a striking feature, it calls it. The degree of Hindu-Muslim unity they manifested. People were actually coming together across religious lines to oppose British rule.
Which makes the political failure that followed even more heartbreaking, really.
It does. That unity on the streets contrasts so starkly with the failure of the big political players, Congress and the Muslim League, to find common ground, to achieve religious reconciliation and social harmony. And that failure, tragically, fed into the horrific violence.
The scale of that violence is almost unimaginable. The source mentions the Great Calcutta killings in August 1946.
Yeah, which apparently kicked off a year of almost continuous rioting across northern and eastern India.
Full year of rioting.
And then culminating in Well, the massacres that accompanied the transfer of populations when the partition of India was announced.
The human cost,
Yeah.
just staggering. Millions becoming refugees, Muslims heading to what became Pakistan, Hindus and Sikhs moving into India.
And so many didn't make it. Facing sudden death or just being completely torn away from everything they'd ever known, their age-old roots. That was the immediate, brutal reality framing the Assembly's work.
And if that wasn't enough chaos, there was another huge problem lurking: the princely states.
Ah, yes, the scarcely less serious problem, as the source puts it. This was about a third of the land mass of the subcontinent. Hundreds of states ruled by Maharajas, Nawabs.
Who were technically allied with the British Crown, but mostly ran their own shows internally.
Right, and when the British announced they were leaving, the status of these states became completely up in the air. Some rulers started getting ambitious, having wild dreams of independent power, maybe imagining India breaking up into many pieces.
So you've got this assembly trying to write a constitution for one India, while outside there's mass violence, millions fleeing, and hundreds of princes potentially trying to carve out their own little kingdoms.
Exactly. The source is blunt. The idea that the debates within the assembly remained insulated from what was happening outside was just impossible. The chaos wasn't just noise. It was a constant pressure, shaping anxieties, shaping priorities, pushing them towards certain compromises, the need for stability, for unity, for a strong state. It felt incredibly urgent.
Okay, so who are the people actually in this Constituent Assembly tasked with this immense job amidst all that turmoil? How did they get there? It wasn't a direct election like we have now.
No, that's a really crucial point to understand. The members were not elected by universal adult franchise. Not every adult got a direct vote for them.
So how were they chosen?
They were chosen by the provincial legislatures that already existed, and those legislatures had been elected back in the winter of 1945-46.
And those elections themselves weren't fully democratic either, right? The franchise was limited.
Very limited compared to universal suffrage. So the Assembly's connection to the will of the people was, let's say, indirect at best in terms of election mechanics.
And one political party really dominated those provincial elections, and therefore the Assembly itself.
That's right. The source states the Assembly was overwhelmingly dominated by one party, the Congress. We'd swept the general seats in those 45-46 elections, so something like 82% of the members in the Constituent Assembly were also members of the Congress Party.
Wow, 82%. That's a massive majority for the party writing the Constitution.
It is. But it's also important to remember who wasn't there. The Muslim League, demanding Pakistan, boycotted the Assembly completely. They wanted their own separate constitution-making body.
Okay.
And initially, some socialists also stayed away. They were skeptical, seeing the Assembly as a kind of British creation, questioning if it could really be autonomous.
But even with Congress having such a huge majority, was it like a single bloc? Did they all agree on everything?
Not at all. And the source is very clear on this. It emphasizes that the Congress was not a party with one voice. Its members differed in their opinion on critical issues.
So internal debates were happening?
Absolutely. You had people inspired by socialism wanting land reform,
Right
alongside staunch defenders of landlordism. You had members close to communal parties and others who were assertively secular. It was a broad church.
What held them together then?
The shared experience of the national movement. And their history, the source notes, had taught them to debate their ideas in public and negotiate their differences. So even within that dominant Congress group, you had real, vigorous debate.
And it wasn't all happening behind closed doors. The public had some input.
Yeah, this is interesting. The deliberations weren't secret. They're actually reported widely in newspapers, debated publicly. The source says, criticisms and counter-criticisms in the press in turn shaped the nature of the consensus that was ultimately reached.
So public opinion mattered.
It seems so. And they even formally invited the public to send in views. So you had linguistic minorities asking for protection, religious minorities wanting safeguards, Dalits demanding an end to caste oppression and reservation. These demands came from the public into the assembly and were debated on the floor. It wasn't entirely sealed off.
So within this group of around 300 members, dealing with all this chaos, dominated by a diverse Congress party, who were the real heavyweights, the key architects.
The source highlights 6 people who played particularly important roles. Firstly, there's the crucial Congress trio, Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, and Rajendra Prasad.
Nehru, obviously India's first prime minister. What was his specific role in the making of the Constitution?
Nehru was really central in setting the vision, the aspirational tone. He introduced the pivotal objectives resolution, which basically laid out the guiding principles.
The foundation stone, in a way.
Exactly. He also moved the resolution defining the national flag, the tricolor we know today. And of course, he delivered that incredibly famous Tryst with Destiny speech at midnight on August 14th, 1947.
At the stroke of the midnight hour. Unforgettable words.
Absolutely captured the weight and hope of that moment.
And Vallabh Bhai Patel, often seen as the pragmatist, the organizer.
Patel's work, the source says, was mostly behind the scenes. He was crucial in drafting reports for various committees and really key in working to reconcile opposing points of view. A tough negotiator, especially on things like integrating the princely states and dealing with minority rights. We'll hear his strong voice later.
And the third of that trio, Rajendra Prasad.
Prasad was the president of the Assembly. His job was to steer the discussions, which were often long and heated, along constructive lines while making sure all members had a chance to speak. Keeping that huge, diverse, passionate group focused on drafting a constitution, that's a vital role.
Okay, so those three Congress giants. Who else was indispensable?
Without a doubt, B.R. Ambedkar, a brilliant lawyer, an economist, and importantly, the source points out he'd actually been a political opponent of the Congress during the freedom struggle.
Really? So how did he end up playing such a key role?
Apparently, it was on Mahatma Gandhi's advice that he was invited to join the first cabinet after independence as law minister. And then he took on perhaps the most critical job in the Assembly, chairman of the drafting committee.
The committee that actually wrote the text.
Exactly. They took all the decisions, the principles, the resolutions, and hammered them into legal language. Ambedkar's task was monumental, guiding the entire draft constitution through the Assembly, clause by clause. The sheer volume of work. The printed records of just the discussions on the draft fill 11 bulky volumes.
11 volumes of debate.
It shows the intensity. And he had other sharp legal minds helping him, like K.M. Munshi and Aladi Krishnaswamy Iyer, giving crucial inputs.
Were there non-politicians involved too? Technical experts?
Yes, the source highlights two crucial civil servants. B.N. Rao served as the constitutional advisor. He did a lot of the groundwork, preparing background papers, studying other countries' constitutions to give the members options and ideas.
Kind of like providing the raw materials.
In a way. And then S.N. Mukherjee was the chief draftsman. He had the technical skill to take all the complex ideas and compromises and put them into clear legal language, a vital practical skill.
So a real mix of political leadership, legal intellect, and administrative skill.
Absolutely.
Oh.
And the source sums it up by saying the process, though long, was extremely interesting. Members were often eloquent in expressing their sometimes very divergent points of view. These debates really reveal many conflicting ideas of India, what kind of economy, what political system, even what moral values the new nation should stand for.
And that core vision, those fundamental ideals, they really started crystallizing with Nehru's Objectives Resolution, didn't they?
They did. When Nehru introduced it back on December 13, 1946, he called it a momentous resolution. It wasn't the Constitution itself, but it outlined the defining ideals and provided the framework for everything that came after.
What were the key things it declared?
It proclaimed India would be an independent sovereign republic. Crucially, it guaranteed citizens justice, equality, and freedom. And it specifically assured adequate safeguards for minorities, for backward and tribal areas, and for the depressed classes and other backward classes.
In his speech introducing it, Nehru apparently looked beyond India, placing it in a wider historical context.
Yes, Source 1 gives us insight into this. He deliberately linked India's effort to the longer story of struggles for liberty globally. He mentioned the founding of the American nation, its constitution having stood the test of so many years. He spoke admiringly of the French Revolution, that mighty revolution, and its Constituent Assembly.
Trying to connect their work to these big world-changing moments.
Exactly. He even recounted the famous Oath of the Tennis Court story from the French Revolution, how the members, locked out of their usual hall, swore they wouldn't disperse until they'd finished drafting a constitution. Nehru said he hoped the Indian Assembly was meeting in that solemn spirit. It really elevated the sense of purpose.
Did he mention any more recent revolutions?
He did. He referred to a more recent revolution that created a new type of state, clearly talking about the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union, calling it a mighty country, and a neighboring country playing a huge role in the world. So his perspective was broad.
But he wasn't suggesting they just copy any of these models.
No, absolutely not. This is a really key point from Source 1. He stated very clearly, we are not going just to copy. They needed to learn from others' successes and failures, sure, but the system they created had to fit in with the temper of our people and be acceptable to them. He even hinted that maybe Western democracies needed to evolve, suggesting India could potentially create something even better suited to the times. It was a call for creative thinking.
He also explained why the word democratic wasn't explicitly in the resolution, which seems odd now.
Yes, he addressed that head-on in Source 1. Some members asked about it. Nehru argued that the word republic inherently included the idea of democracy. He said they wanted to avoid unnecessary words and redundant words. But his stronger point was that they'd done more than just use the word. They put the content of democracy into the resolution, guaranteeing justice, equality, and crucially, economic democracy. He felt the substance mattered more than the label.
And he was quite open about his own political leanings, too.
Very open. He declared personally, well, I stand for socialism, and I hope India will stand for socialism, and that India will go towards the constitution of a socialist state. He hoped the whole world would move that way. So his vision was really about blending liberal democratic ideas with socialist ideals of economic justice, but adapting them for India.
So that was the grand vision laid out by Nehru. But not everyone in the assembly felt they actually had the power to achieve it. Some felt they were still operating under Britain's shadow.
Exactly. That brings us to a really sharp critique from Somnath Lahiri, a communist member, captured in Source 2. He saw the dark hand of British imperialism hanging over the deliberations, a much more cynical view.
Why did he feel they were still controlled? What was his argument?
He argued the assembly was essentially working the British plans as the British should like it to be worked out. He felt the whole constitution they were writing would ultimately depend on a treaty satisfactory to the Britisher.
Meaning Britain still held the trump cards?
That was his view. He pointed to practical things. If there's a dispute, where do you go? Maybe the federal court, or maybe you have to dance attendance there in England, or to call on the British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. He felt they were still under the shadow of British guns, British army, their economic and financial stranglehold.
A pretty bleak assessment.
Very bleak. His conclusion, quoting from Source 2, was stark. The final power is still in the British hands. He even mentioned recent British threats about division entirely, if needed, a grim foreshadowing. And he referenced Sardar Patel apparently saying just days before, maybe in frustration, "We have freedom only to fight among ourselves. That is the only freedom we have got." Lahiri concluded flatly, there is no freedom in this country.
So, if they weren't truly free in his eyes, what did Lahiri propose they should do?
His solution was radical. Declare independence here and now. Just assert it. He urged the interim government and the people to stop the fratricidal warfare, the communal violence, and instead focus on the real enemy, the British imperialism, and fight it together first, then sort out internal issues later.
How did Nehru and the Congress majority respond to that kind of fundamental challenge to the Assembly's legitimacy?
Nehru tackled it directly. He acknowledged that yes, nationalists had wanted a different setup, and yes, the British did have a hand in its birth and attached conditions, but he strongly pushed back against the idea they lacked real power.
Where did he say their strength came from, then?
From the people behind us. That was his core argument. He said, governments do not come into being by state papers. Governments are, in fact, the expression of the will of the people. He insisted they were meeting because of the strength of the people behind us, and we shall go as far as the people shall wish us to go. Their mandate, he stressed, was to fulfill the passions that lie in the hearts of the masses.
So he rooted their authority not in British permission, but in the Indian people and the history of the freedom struggle.
Exactly. The source explicitly connects this to that longer history. Ideals like democracy, equality, justice, they weren't just imported concepts. They were deeply associated with social struggles in India since the 19th century.
Like the social reformers fighting caste injustice, or workers and peasants demanding economic rights.
Precisely. Social reformers fighting child marriage, Vivekananda reforming Hinduism, Jyotiva Phule championing the depressed castes, communists and socialists organizing workers. The entire national movement against colonial oppression was, the source argues, inevitably a struggle for democracy and justice, for citizens' rights and equality.
And this Constituent Assembly, unlike the earlier British reforms, was seen as an expression of that struggle.
Fundamentally different. Those British Acts, 1909, 1919, 1935, were responses to pressure, sure, but they were not directly debated and formulated by Indians. They were imposed by the colonial government.
And voting rights were incredibly limited under those acts.
Right. Even the 1935 Act only gave the vote to maybe 10–15% of adults. No universal franchise. And the legislatures they created were ultimately answerable to the British governor, not the Indian people. Nehru's vision, laid out in December 46, was for an independent, sovereign Republic of India, drawing legitimacy from the people. So while Lahiri saw the British shadow, Nehru and the majority saw their power rooted in the Indian masses and the freedom movement.
Okay, so they've asserted their authority, framed the vision, dealt with the external chaos. Now, the really intricate part, defining rights. For such a diverse country, who gets what? What protections are needed?
This was hugely complex. As the source says, there were no collectively shared answers when they started. The solutions really evolved through the clash of opinions and the drama of individual encounters. Nehru wanted to fulfill the passions of the masses, but the masses had very different, sometimes conflicting demands.
One of the thorniest issues inherited from the British era was separate electorates. That had been so divisive.
Hugely divisive. The system where, say, only Muslims voted for Muslim candidates. In August 1947, just after partition, B. Pakar Bahadur from Madras made a powerful plea, in Source 3, to keep this system.
Why? What was his reasoning?
He argued minorities exist, you can't wish them away. For them to live in harmony and have a meaningful voice, they needed a political framework. He felt separate electorates gave Muslims that voice, arguing non-Muslims couldn't truly understand their needs or choose their representatives.
But by this point, most nationalists were completely against the idea.
Fiercely against it. They saw it as a British tactic, deliberately introduced to divide the people. R.V. Dilakar's quote captures the anger, accusing the English of playing a game under the cover of safeguards and urging minorities to give it up now there is no one to misguide you.
And the recent horror of partition must have just solidified that opposition.
Absolutely. The source says nationalists were haunted by the fear of continued civil war, riots, and violence. Sardar Patel's words in Source 3 are incredibly blunt. He called separate electorates a poison that has entered the body politic, blaming it for turning communities against each other, causing bloodshed, and leading directly to partition.
A poison. Strong language.
His plea was direct. Do you want peace? If so, do away with it. He saw it as the mischief behind left by the British, something they absolutely could not perpetuate.
Governmental Pant, in Source 4, offered another line of argument against it, saying it was actually bad for the minorities themselves.
Yes, Pant made that case. He agreed democracy needs minority confidence and majority empathy. But he argued separate electorates were suicidal to the minorities. Why? Because they would be permanently isolated, making them vulnerable, denying them any real influence in the broader system.
Because they can never become a majority on their own.
Exactly. If they are isolated forever, they can never convert themselves into a majority, and the feeling of frustration will cripple them. He called segregation extremely dangerous for them, kept aloof in an airtight compartment.
What was the underlying principle driving this intense opposition from figures like Patel and Pant? It seems like it was about nation building.
Fundamentally, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It was about the making of a unified nation state. The ideal was every individual as a citizen of the state, every group assimilated within the nation. Communities could have cultural rights, sure, but politically, everyone had to be an equal member of one state.
To avoid divided loyalties.
That was the fear. Pant worried about the unwholesome habit of thinking always in terms of communities and never in terms of citizens. He insisted it is the citizen that must count. There was this lurking fear, the source says, that focusing on community rights could weaken the new nation and state. Source 5 gives Pant's definition of a loyal citizen, someone who focused on the state, not narrow self-interest, avoiding rival loyalties.
And it wasn't just a Hindu versus Muslim thing. Some Muslim members also opposed separate electorates by this stage.
Right. Begum Isis Rasul is mentioned as finding them self-destructive. By 1949, the source notes, most Muslim members still in the assembly agreed they were against minority interests and that they needed to participate fully in the mainstream democratic process to have influence.
So the debate over religious minorities was intense. But then there was this other argument. Who are the real minorities? N.G. Ranga argued it wasn't about religion, but economics.
Yes, Ranga, a socialist and peasant leader, really shifted the focus. Source 6. He asked, who are the real minorities? His answer, not the Hindus, not the Sikhs, not even the Muslims. No, the real minorities are the masses of this country.
The poor, the downtrodden.
Exactly, the depressed and oppressed and suppressed. He argued that for them, just having legal rights on paper right to live, civil liberties was meaningless without the actual means to exercise those rights.
They needed practical help.
He put it powerfully. It was essential to create conditions where these constitutionally enshrined rights could be effectively enjoyed. For this, they needed protection. They need props. They need a ladder.
Did he give examples of how legal rights failed the poor?
He did. He talked about merchants cheating tribal people out of their land despite protective laws, trapping them in debt bondage, moneylenders and landlords exploiting villagers, the lack of basic education holding people back. These, he argued, were the people who truly needed protection and assurances of protection.
And he acknowledged that the assembly members themselves were mostly not from those backgrounds.
Yes, he reflected that most of us do not belong to the masses themselves. He saw the members as trustees, as champions, trying their best, but ultimately speaking for the masses, not as them. It's a powerful reframing of who needs minority protection.
Beyond the economic lens, specific historically oppressed groups also made their voices heard. Tribals, depressed castes, women. What about the tribal communities?
Jaipal Singh, a prominent tribal leader and eloquent speaker, made a very moving contribution. He welcomed the objectives resolution, but spoke plainly about the historical injustice faced by his people, the Adabasis.
What was his core message?
Quote him, "If there is any group of Indian people that has been shabbily treated, it is my people. They've been disgracefully treated and neglected for the last 6,000 years. 6,000 years. He talked about continuous exploitation and dispossession, being pushed off their land, seen as primitive and backward, and generally spurned by the rest of society.
But he wasn't asking for separation.
No, quite the opposite. His plea was for integration, for breaking down the distance. Quote him, "Our point is that you got to mix with us. We are willing to mix with you." His specific demand, not separate electorates, but reservation of seats in the legislature.
Why reservation?
He argued it was essential to allow tribals to represent themselves, to make sure their unique voice was heard, to compel others to hear the voice of tribals and come near them. It was about ensuring presence and agency within the democratic system.
And the depressed castes, the formerly untouchable groups. Their struggle for rights had a long, complex history too, especially involving Ambedkar and Gandhi.
It did. The assembly had to grapple with this legacy. Some depressed caste members, like Jayanagappa, argued the root problem wasn't just lack of safeguards, but the social norms and the moral values of caste society itself. He said, "We have been suffering, but we are prepared to suffer no more. We know how to assert ourselves."
He also pointed out they weren't actually a numerical minority.
Right. He stressed they were 25% of the population. Their issue wasn't numbers, but systematic marginalization, exclusion from education, from administration. K.J. Khandrakar added powerfully about being suppressed for thousands of years, suppressed to such an extent that neither our minds nor our bodies and now even our hearts work, nor are we able to march forward.
So how did the Constitution address this deep-seated oppression?
Crucially, after partition, Ambedkar himself dropped the demand for separate electorates for depressed castes. The Assembly then agreed on major steps. Formally abolishing untouchability in Article 17, opening Hindu temples to all castes, and significantly providing for reservation of seats in legislatures and government jobs for these groups, later known as scheduled castes.
Recognizing that law alone wouldn't change attitudes, but providing concrete measures.
Exactly. These measures were welcomed as essential steps, even if everyone knew changing social mindsets would take longer.
And women members in the assembly also spoke up for their rights.
Yes, figures like Dakshani Valayavan, Source 7, argued against needing special safeguards, wanting instead a moral safeguard and the immediate removal of our social disabilities. She interestingly refused to frame the 70 million Harijans as just a minority. Hansa Mehta, Source 8, demanded social justice, economic justice, and political justice for women, but specifically argued against reserved seats or separate electorates for women, insisting that equality itself was the basis of mutual respect.
So a really complex tapestry of rights claims based on religion, caste, economics, tribal identity, gender, all being debated and negotiated.
Absolutely. And the final shape of the fundamental rights, the directive principles, the reservation policies, it all reflects the compromises made trying to balance individual liberty with group rights and historical disadvantage.
Okay, let's shift from rights to structure. The balance of power between the center and the states, this sounds like another huge battleground, heavily influenced by partition.
Definitely one of the most vigorously debated topics. How much power stays in Delhi versus how much goes to the provinces or states as they became.
And Nehru was firmly in the camp of a strong center, especially after partition.
He was. A letter he wrote to the assembly president is quoted, Now that partition is a settled fact, it would be injurious to the interests of the country to provide for a weak central authority.
Why did partition make him feel that way so strongly?
The sheer chaos, the violence, the displacement, the challenge of integrating hundreds of princely states, it all created this powerful sense that India needed a strong hand at the tiller. A weak center, he argued, couldn't ensure peace, couldn't coordinate vital matters, couldn't speak effectively for India internationally. Centralization seemed necessary for survival and stability.
And the draft constitution reflected this strong center bias.
Very much so. Look at the division of powers. The union list, center only. State list, states only. Concurrent list, both. The source says there were many more items put exclusively under union control than in many other federations, and more on the concurrent list than provinces wanted.
The center controlled key industries, minerals.
Yes. And then there was the controversial Article 356, giving the center the power to take over a state's administration in certain situations. That was a big one.
What about money, finances?
Also skewed towards the center. The source describes a complex system of fiscal federalism. Basically, the center kept control of major revenue sources like customs, company taxes, and shared things like income tax. States were left with less buoyant sources like land revenue and sales tax. This financial imbalance was a huge point of friction.
Were other leaders also pushing for a strong center?
Oh, yes. Ambedkar, despite past differences with Congress, stated she wanted a strong and united center, much stronger than the center we had created under the Government of India Act of 1935. Many members, deeply affected by the partition riots, felt strengthened central powers were essential to prevent future communal frenzy. Gopalaswamy Iyengar just flat out said the center should be made as strong as possible. Balakrishna Sharma argued only a strong center could plan nationally, mobilize resources, run administration, and defend the country.
This seems like a real shift from the pre-partition Congress position, which was apparently more open to provincial autonomy.
That's a key observation the source makes. Before partition, Congress had been more willing to concede autonomy, partly to try and keep the Muslim League within a united India framework. After partition, that political calculation was gone. The trauma of violence, the existing colonial unitary structure, the perceived need for economic planning, it all gave a further push to centralization. It felt necessary to forestall chaos. So the Constitution ended up with a clear bias towards the rights of the Union.
But surely there was pushback, voices arguing for stronger states.
Absolutely. K. Santhanam from Madras was a very articulate advocate for state rights. He argued logically that just piling powers onto the center doesn't automatically make it strong. It might just make it overburdened and ineffective.
So redistribute powers more sensibly.
That was his point. He argued reallocation could strengthen both the center and the states. His big worry was the financial crippling of the states. He said the proposed system would leave provinces impoverished as most taxes went to Delhi. How could they develop education, sanitation, roads, industries without funds?
He made a pretty dramatic statement about it.
He did. He said, if states were going to be so weak financially, let us rather wipe out the federal system and let us have a unitary system. He even darkly predicted that if things weren't balanced better, the provinces would rise in revolt against the center within a few years.
Were others echoing these fears?
Yes. Many others in the provinces echoed the same fears, fighting to keep more subjects on the state list. A member from Orissa warned that excessive centralization might actually cause the center is likely to break. And Sir Ramaswamy Mudaliar, Source 9, subtly questioned if just demanding a strong center made you a better patriot, suggesting real patriotism lay in a more vigorous examination of how resources were actually divided.
So a real tug-of-war between the immediate need for stability driving centralization and longer-term concerns about federal balance and state capacity.
Precisely. The final federal structure, with its strong central leanings, is a direct product of that intense debate and the anxieties of that specific moment.
Okay, let's move to maybe the most emotionally charged debate of all. Language. How do you possibly choose a national language for a country with such incredible linguistic diversity?
Yeah, this issue generated intense arguments, debated over many months. It touched nerves, identity, culture, everything. How could people from different regions even communicate within this new nation?
Mahatma Gandhi had a clear vision for this, didn't he? Hindustani.
Yes, by the 1930s, Congress, influenced by Gandhi, had adopted the idea that Hindustani should be the national language. Gandhi's core belief was simple. The national language should be one the common people could easily understand. He saw Hindustani as that language, a popular language, a blend of Hindi and Urdu.
Not pure Hindi, not pure Urdu, but a mix.
Exactly. A composite language enriched by the interaction of diverse cultures, able to absorb words from many sources. He felt this inclusive, multicultural language was ideal for communication and could unite Hindus and Muslims north and south.
But the source notes that even by then, Hindi and Urdu were drifting apart, becoming more associated with specific religious communities.
They were. From the late 19th century, as communal politics grew, you saw a conscious effort by some to Sanskritize Hindi, purging Persian Arabic words, and by others to Persianize Urdu. Language got tangled up with religious identity politics.
Yet Gandhi stuck to his ideal of the composite Hindustani.
He did. Source 10 gives his definition. Neither Sanskritized Hindi nor Persianized Urdu, but a happy combination of both. It should freely borrow words, develop into a rich and powerful instrument for all human thought. He famously said that confining oneself to just Hindi or just Urdu was a crime against intelligence and the spirit of patriotism. For him, inclusivity was key to unity.
But inside the assembly, the push for Hindi, specifically a more Sanskritized Hindi, became quite forceful.
It did. R.V. Dulekar, a congressman from UP, was a very passionate, some would say aggressive advocate for Hindi. Early on, he caused a huge row by demanding Hindi be used for constitution making and telling members who didn't know it they were not worthy, they better leave.
Wow, that's confrontational.
Extremely. And this tension didn't go away. Nearly 3 years later, in September 1949, another speech by Dulekar sparked off a huge storm. By then, the Assembly's Language Committee had tried to find a compromise.
What was the compromise?
They proposed Hindi in Devanagari script as the official language note, official, not national, with a gradual transition. English would continue for 15 years, and provinces could choose their own regional official languages. It was an attempt to placate ruffled emotions.
But Dulekar rejected this.
He did. He wanted national language, not just official. He attacked those who protested Hindi imposition or those who invoked Gandhi to support Hindustani. He saw Hindi becoming official as a consummation of a historic process. The source says his tone really upset many members. The president had to keep interrupting him.
And this aggressive push for Hindi understandably caused a backlash, especially from the South.
A huge backlash. Srimati G. Durgabai from Madras spoke out the day after Dulekar, source 5.2. She said the issue had suddenly become a highly controversial issue, and non-Hindi speakers felt the Hindi campaign was a fight for effectively preventing the natural influence of other powerful languages.
Even she, having promoted Hindi herself in the South, was now concerned.
Yes, she expressed shock, having faced resistance doing that work earlier. She felt changing Hindustani by removing Urdu and regional words was destroying its inclusive and composite character, creating anxieties and fears.
How did they resolve this incredibly divisive issue in the end?
As things got more heated, there were appeals for calm and accommodation. Shankaradeo accepted Hindustani, but warned the Hindi advocates, "If you want my wholehearted support, you must not do now anything which may raise my suspicions." T.A. Ramalingam Chettiar from Madras urged caution, mutual adjustment, no forcing things for the sake of a united nation. Ultimately, the Assembly adopted the compromise formula. Hindi is the official language, English continuing for 15 years, provinces having autonomy for their languages. It was a pragmatic, if imperfect, solution to a deeply emotional conflict.
It sounds like so many of these key issues involved intense disagreement driven by history, identity, and the pressures of the moment. But were there areas where they actually found broad agreement?
Thankfully, yes. Amidst all the conflict, certain fundamental principles did command a wide consensus. They formed the essential foundation.
About the right to vote?
Absolutely central. Universal adult franchise.
Yeah.
The source calls this an unprecedented act of faith. From the very beginning, every single adult citizen, man, woman, rich, poor, literate, illiterate, regardless of caste or religion, got the vote.
Which was radically different from how voting rights evolved elsewhere.
Completely different. In older democracies like the UK or US, suffrage expanded slowly, painfully, over generations. Property owners first, then maybe educated men, then working men, and women often only after long, hard struggles. India just leaped straight to universality, a massive statement of democratic faith.
What about secularism? Was that an area agreement?
Yes, although the word secular wasn't initially in the preamble, the force argues the principle was core, embedded in the fundamental rights.
How so? Which rights?
Through guaranteeing freedom of religion, Articles 25-28, the right to practice, profess, propagate religion. through cultural and educational rights, Articles 29-30, protecting minorities' language, culture, and institutions, and crucially, through the rights to equality, Articles 14, 16, 17, prohibiting discrimination based on religion by the state, especially in employment, and abolishing untouchability.
So the state wouldn't play favorites among religions.
That was the principle. All religions were guaranteed equal treatment by the state. And the state tried to maintain some distance, banning compulsory religious instruction in state schools, for instance, and forbidding religious discrimination in government jobs.
But the Indian version of secularism isn't a strict separation, is it? The state can intervene in religious matters sometimes.
That's the distinct feature. The source points out the Constitution created legal space for social reform within communities. This allowed the state to ban untouchability, which had religious sanction for some, and later to reform personal laws related to marriage, divorce, inheritance, even if they were tied to religious customs. It's what the source calls the Indian variant, not absolute separation, but a kind of judicious distance, allowing intervention for social justice.
So even amidst fierce debates on identity, these core principles, universal suffrage, a commitment to secularism provided common ground.
It's essential common ground. They were vital for holding the whole project together and defining the character of the new republic.
So looking back at this whole 3-year process, how should we understand how this enormous, complex constitution actually came into being?
I think the key takeaway is that it emerged through a process of intense debate and discussion. It wasn't handed down, it was forged. Many crucial provisions, especially the really tricky ones about rights or the center-state balance, were the result of give and take by forging a middle ground between two opposed positions.
So compromise was central. It wasn't just one side winning all the argument.
Not at all. Understanding those debates is vital because it shows the conflicting voices, the many demands being made, the different ideals that were invoked. But it also shows the framers weren't just rigidly applying abstract ideals, they were reworking ideals according to what seemed appropriate within a context. And crucially, people's minds changed. The source says members changed their ideas as the debate unfolded over 3 years, rethinking positions based on hearing other arguments and, critically, reacting to the incredibly turbulent events happening all around them.
So it was a living, breathing process responding to arguments and reality.
Exactly. Document born from intense deliberation, necessary compromise, and constant adaptation in a time of unprecedented national upheaval.
So wrapping up our deep dive today, we've journeyed through those incredibly intense, often fraught debates that shaped India's constitution. We saw the struggle to define rights for such a diverse society grappling with religious minorities, caste oppression, women's equality.
And that massive tug-of-war over power between the center and the states, deeply scarred by the experience of partition.
Absolutely, and that incredibly emotional battle over language, which really threatened to fracture the assembly before that compromise was reached. We saw the conflicts, yes, but also the vital compromises and the bedrock agreements like universal voting rights and secularism that held it together.
And underlying all that negotiation, all that argument, was this powerful shared aspiration to build a unified, independent, sovereign republic, one committed to democracy, justice, equality for everyone, even as the nation was facing such immense turmoil.
And understanding these foundational arguments, these passionate struggles, isn't just history for its own sake. It really helps you appreciate the document that still governs India today. These weren't dry legal points. They were fundamental questions about how a diverse people could live together, being debated by real people at a pivotal moment.
Which really leaves us with something to think about, doesn't it? Given that the framers' own ideas evolved, that so many key parts of the Constitution were compromises hammered out through intense debate between opposing views, what does that tell us about a Constitution as a living document?
Right. How does that history of negotiation, of disagreement, maybe offer lessons for us today when we face our own complex divisions and challenges in India or anywhere else?
Think about those core tensions they grappled with. Unity versus diversity, central power versus state autonomy, individual rights versus group identity. They weren't definitively solved back then. They were woven into the very fabric of the Constitution, perhaps leaving space for ongoing interpretation, ongoing debate.
It's a powerful reminder, maybe, that the work of defining and building a nation is never really finished. It continues.